For a long time, I believed that my life was moving forward simply because time was passing. Days followed days. Years followed years. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. I had responsibilities. I had routines. I had a direction that made sense to other people. And because everything looked acceptable, I assumed it was enough. I didn't feel unhappy, but I also didn't feel deeply alive. I moved through my days with efficiency, completing tasks, meeting expectations, checking boxes that were placed in front of me. Life felt organized, predictable, and controlled. That control gave me a sense of safety. It told me I was doing things correctly. English existed far outside this controlled world. It belonged to another version of life, a life that involved risk, uncertainty, and the possibility of being misunderstood. Learning English felt like opening a door without knowing what was on the other side, and I wasn't ready for that. I had built my identity around being capable, around knowing what to do, around avoiding situations where I might feel small or unsure. English threatened that identity. It required me to slow down, to hesitate, to accept that I wouldn't always have the right words. And that was uncomfortable, so I postponed it. Whenever English appeared in a video suggestion, in a job requirement, in a conversation I overheard, told myself it wasn't necessary. I told myself I was too busy, too tired, too focused on other priorities. I convinced myself that learning English was something people did when they had extra time, extra energy, extra confidence. I didn't have any of those, or at least, that's what I believed. What I actually had was fear, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that hides behind responsibility, the kind that convinces you that staying where you are is the mature choice, the kind that makes avoidance look reasonable. I stayed busy enough not to notice the cost. My days were full, but my mind felt crowded. I was constantly thinking about what needed to be done next, rarely about what I actually wanted. When moments of silence appeared, I filled them quickly, with my phone, with plans, with distractions that kept deeper questions away. Those questions didn't disappear. They waited. Sometimes they surfaced late at night, when everything else was quiet. I would feel a subtle heaviness, a sense that something was incomplete, not broken, just unfinished. I didn't call it dissatisfaction. I called it adulthood. I told myself this was normal, that life wasn't supposed to feel exciting all the time, that stability mattered more than curiosity, that risk was for younger people, or braver people, or people who hadn't yet learned to be realistic. English remained distant because it represented everything I had learned to avoid. It represented being a beginner again, being slow, being imperfect. It represented stepping outside the image of myself that I had carefully maintained. I watched others speak English imperfectly, confidently, without apologizing for their mistakes, and I felt something tighten inside me. Not envy, not admiration, something closer to recognition mixed with fear, as if a part of me remembered what it felt like to learn freely before performance became important. I ignored that feeling. I told myself my life was already defined, that there was no reason to disturb it, that learning English wouldn't change anything important, that it was optional. But over time, optional began to feel heavy. I noticed how defensive I became when things didn't go as planned, how easily frustration surfaced when I felt uncertain, how much energy I spent protecting myself from situations where I might look unprepared. I didn't connect these reactions to English. I thought they were just part of my personality. I thought this was who I was. Still, something inside me was growing tired. Not tired of work, but tired of control. Tired of maintaining an image. Tired of pretending that certainty was the same as peace. I didn't know yet that English would eventually challenge this belief. I didn't know yet that learning a language would force me to face not my limitations, but my relationship with failure. At this stage, English was still just a language, still distant, still unnecessary. I continued living as I always had, efficient, responsible, controlled. I believed that if I kept everything stable, clarity would eventually arrive. That confidence would come later. That life would feel lighter once I reached the next milestone. I didn't realize that the weight I was carrying came from waiting. Waiting to feel ready. Waiting to feel confident. Waiting to feel certain. And as long as I waited, English remained far away, not because it was difficult, but because I was afraid of what it might change. After a long time of living inside that careful balance, something subtle began to shift. Not because my life changed, and not because something went wrong, but because I started to notice how much effort it took to keep everything exactly the same. Stability, I realized, was not effortless. It required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant avoidance of anything that might disturb it. I began to notice how often I said no to things without really considering them. Not because I didn't have time, but because I didn't want to feel uncertain. My days were full, but my choices were narrow. I moved between familiar points, repeating patterns that felt safe. Even when they no longer felt meaningful, English returned to my thoughts during this period, not as a goal, but as a quiet reminder of something unfinished. It represented a path I had stepped away from long ago, not because it was impossible, but because it made me uncomfortable. The idea of being slow again, of not understanding, of needing help, it touched something sensitive inside me one evening. After a day that looked successful from the outside, I felt an unexpected sense of restlessness. I wasn't stressed. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was simply aware of how little space there was in my life for curiosity. Everything felt decided, prearranged, predictable. That awareness stayed with me longer than usual. I didn't rush to distract myself. I didn't immediately label it as dissatisfaction. I let it exist, and in that quiet, a thought surfaced gently. What if avoiding uncertainty was costing me more than I realized? That question didn't demand an answer. It didn't accuse me. It simply waited. In the days that followed, I noticed how quickly I reacted whenever something felt unfamiliar. I noticed how often I dismissed new ideas by telling myself they weren't practical. I had learned to value efficiency over exploration, certainty over openness. English, again, appeared quietly in the background. I didn't decide to study. I didn't make a plan. One day, I simply listened to a short English story, not to learn, not to improve, just to hear it. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was just passing time, but something about the voice caught my attention. It was slow, unhurried. The speaker didn't rush to sound impressive. There were pauses, small hesitations, repeated ideas. And strangely, that imperfection felt calming. I noticed how different this felt from the way I usually learned things. There was no pressure to understand everything, no sense of urgency. I could stop at any moment. That freedom made it possible to stay. I listened again another day, and then again. Not consistently, not intentionally, only when I felt open enough. English entered my life quietly, without demand, without expectation. And because it asked for nothing, I didn't resist it. I began to see how much of my resistance had come from fear, not inability. Fear of starting without knowing where it would lead. Fear of investing time without guaranteed results. Fear of looking incapable, even to myself. That fear had shaped my life more than I wanted to admit. It had kept me safe, but it had also kept me small. I had avoided many beginnings simply because they didn't promise success. Listening to English did not make me confident, but it made me honest. Honest about how uncomfortable I felt when I wasn't in control. Honest about how much energy I spent protecting an image of competence. There were moments when I wanted to stop, when I felt slow, when I felt behind. In the past, those moments would have ended the effort. This time, they didn't. Not because I forced myself to continue, but because stopping felt less truthful than staying. I began to notice how my body responded when I stayed. The tension I usually carried softened slightly. My breathing slowed. I wasn't trying to achieve anything. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply present. That presence began to influence how I lived. I paused more before reacting. I listened longer in conversations. I didn't rush to fill silence. To my surprise, nothing bad happened. People didn't lose respect. Conversations didn't fall apart. I realized how much of my life had been driven by the fear of failure, disguised as responsibility. How often I had chosen what felt safe instead of what felt alive. English was quietly challenging that pattern, not by demanding effort, but by inviting attention. I didn't yet see English as part of my identity. I didn't think of myself as someone learning a language. What I saw was something deeper. I was learning how to remain with discomfort instead of escaping it, how to stay present without needing certainty. That realization didn't make me brave, but it made me curious. And curiosity, unlike motivation, didn't need guarantees. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to stay with something unfamiliar without deciding whether it was worth it. Quiet choice began to loosen the grip that fear had held on me for years. As English remained quietly in my life, I began to notice that the real changes were not happening in the language itself, but in the way I experienced effort. I was no longer chasing improvement. I was simply returning, again and again, without demanding results. That alone felt unfamiliar. There were days when I listened and understood almost nothing. In the past, those days would have felt discouraging. I would have judged myself quickly, deciding that I wasn't progressing fast enough. This time, I stayed, not with determination, but with acceptance. I allowed the confusion to exist without turning it into a story about my ability that was new. I started noticing how deeply I had internalized the idea that effort must always lead to visible outcomes. If progress couldn't be measured, it felt meaningless. English slowly challenged that belief. It offered no clear milestones, no obvious signs of success, and yet something was happening beneath the surface. One evening, While listening to a familiar voice, I realized that I understood the meaning of a sentence without translating it in my head. The moment was small. It passed quickly, but it stayed with me, not because it proved anything, but because it felt natural. It had arrived without force. That moment taught me something important. Understanding doesn't always announce itself. Growth doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels quiet, almost invisible, until you look back and realize you are standing somewhere new. This understanding began to change how I approached other parts of my life. I stopped rushing conversations. I allowed pauses to exist. I noticed how often I had spoken simply to avoid silence. Now, silence felt different. It felt like space rather than absence. At work, I found myself listening more and explaining less. I didn't rush to defend my ideas. I didn't feel the same urgency to prove that I was competent. To my surprise, this didn't make me seem weaker. It made conversations calmer, clearer. I realized how much energy I had spent trying to appear certain, how exhausting it had been to constantly perform competence. English gave me a place where I could let go of that performance, where hesitation was expected, where imperfection was normal. There were still moments of frustration, days when I compared myself to others who seemed more fluent, more confident, more advanced. That comparison didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. I no longer used it as a reason to stop. I recognized it as impatience, not truth. I began to see that my fear of failure had shaped more than my relationship with English. It had shaped my entire life. I had avoided many beginnings simply because they didn't promise success. I had stayed in familiar spaces because they protected my sense of worth. English was slowly changing that relationship. Each mistake I made became less personal. Each misunderstanding became less threatening. Failure was no longer something that defined me. It became something that informed me. I noticed how my internal voice softened. I stopped speaking to myself in terms of judgment and correction. I spoke in terms of observation. Curiosity replaced criticism. Patience replaced urgency. This shift affected how I experienced time. I stopped measuring days by productivity alone. I noticed moments of calm, moments when time felt slower, fuller. Those moments didn't look impressive from the outside, but they felt meaningful. English became a quiet companion in this process. Not something I conquered, but something I walked alongside. Some days we moved slowly, some days barely at all, and that was enough. I began to trust consistency over intensity. Small, repeated moments of attention over dramatic effort. I understood that learning, like growth, happens in layers, and layers require time. Looking back at my earlier self, the one driven by fear of failure and pressure to perform, I felt compassion, not judgment. That version of me had been trying to stay safe, but safety had come at the cost of openness. Now I was learning another way, a way that didn't promise certainty, but offered honesty. A way that didn't eliminate fear, but reduced its control. I realized that English was not something I needed to master to become worthy. It was something I could practice to become more present. It revealed how I responded to slowness, to imperfection, to uncertainty. And what it revealed was this: I was capable of staying with confusion, staying with difficulty, staying with myself, That realization felt steady, quiet, real. I didn't know yet what this process would lead to. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had stopped measuring every step. I had stopped asking whether I was doing enough. I was doing something different. I was learning how to remain, and that, I was beginning to understand, was the foundation for everything that would come next. At some point, without any clear announcement, I stopped asking myself when I would finally feel confident. That question had followed me for years, quietly shaping how I lived. I believed confidence was something you earned after enough effort, enough proof, enough success. But what I was experiencing now was different. Confidence did not arrive. Acceptance did. I accepted that uncertainty would always be part of my life. That hesitation did not mean weakness. That moving slowly did not mean I was falling behind. It simply meant I was paying attention. English was no longer something I was working on. It had become part of my days in small, ordinary ways. I listened without pressure. I spoke without demanding perfection. I allowed pauses. I allowed mistakes. And through that allowance, I began to trust myself again, because I was good, but because I was honest. This honesty began to shape how I lived beyond language. I stopped over-preparing for conversations. I stopped rehearsing everything in my head before speaking. I allowed myself to show up even when my thoughts were unfinished. I discovered that people didn't expect certainty from me. They responded to presence. That realization softened something deep inside me. For years, I had been carrying the weight of expectation. The expectation to perform, to succeed, to avoid failure at all costs. Learning English gently loosened that weight. It showed me that effort does not have to be heavy to be meaningful. There were still moments when fear appeared. Moments when I felt exposed. Moments when I wanted to retreat to familiar ground. But those moments no longer controlled my decisions. I noticed them. I acknowledged them. And then I stayed. Staying became my quiet practice. I stayed with English even when progress felt invisible. I stayed in conversations even when I didn't have the right words. I stayed with myself even when I felt unsure. Through staying, something unexpected happened. Life began to feel lighter. Not because it became easier, but because I stopped fighting my own experience. I stopped treating discomfort as something that needed to be fixed immediately. I saw it as a sign that I was engaged, alive, participating. Looking back, I understand now that my fear of failure had never really been about failing. It had been about identity. I was afraid that mistakes would define me. English taught me that mistakes pass. Presence remains. I didn't become fluent overnight. I didn't suddenly unlock opportunities or transform my career, but something more important changed. I changed how I related to effort, to learning, to myself. I no longer believed that worth came from being flawless. I believed it came from being willing to begin, willing to continue, willing to stay. This way of living slowly spread into everything. I became more patient with my progress, more forgiving of my mistakes, more curious about what I didn't yet understand. I stopped waiting to feel ready before taking small steps. I understood that readiness is not a feeling. It is a decision. If you are listening to this and feel held back by fear of failing, fear of being slow, fear of not being good enough, I want to say this gently. You don't need confidence to start. Confidence grows after you stay, not before. English, like life, does not ask you to be perfect. It asks you to participate, to speak imperfectly, to listen patiently, to move forward without guarantees. You don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to know exactly where this path will lead. You only need to take one small step and remain long enough to notice what begins to change inside. I am still learning. I still hesitate. I still make mistakes. But I no longer see those moments as failures. I see them as evidence that I am participating in my own life instead of observing it from a distance. English did not remove fear from my life. It taught me how to live with fear without letting it decide for me. That lesson has stayed, quietly, steadily, one moment at a time. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing. And if you take one thing with you, let it be this: you don't need certainty to move forward. You only need the courage to stay present when things feel unclear. That is where growth quietly begins.